Now, firstly, what are they? What is a war crime? Essentially, and obviously very clearly from its title, it's a crime committed in a time of war. However, it is still a crime and remains a crime despite its commission in the context of a war where people are killing each other. Now, war provides immunity for certain acts, killing lawfully killing an enemy, but obviously not for others. There are rules that must be obeyed, and therefore violations of the laws and customs of war is essentially what is protected against. The law is not static. There's no crimes of war code which sets out exactly what is and what is not permitted. It's continually evolving, and therefore what may not have been a war crime 10, 15 or 20 years ago may have become. In addition, not all violations of what constitutes the laws and customs of war, or the rules of war, if you like, are war crimes. Now, firstly, and I think this is where the use or the overuse of the term war criminal in general lexicon throughout the world has complicated matters. A war criminal is generally used to describe anyone who may commit any offence in relation to an armed conflict, rather than the technical definition, which is someone who has committed a violation of the laws and customs of war. And this certainly is very clear when you try and distinguish between violation of the jus in bello, the rules applicable during armed conflict, and violations of the jus ad bellum, i.e. The law applicable to entering a conflict, the prohibition against aggression. Very often the two are used synonymously, and people like Tony Blair and George Bush are referred to as war criminals because of what they did in initiating a war in Iraq in 2003. When I'm talking about war crimes in the context of this lecture, and as they're generally understood, it's violations of the laws and customs applicable in an armed conflict. Now, there are two essential types of war crimes. The first one is a grave breach, which generally is the most serious types of offences, and they are referred to in the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which I'll get to a little bit later. And secondly, you have general war crimes or violations of the laws and customs of war, which are not grave breaches. And these are divided into those that are applicable in international armed conflicts and those that are applicable in internal armed conflicts. So moving on to the relevance and rationale for the laws of war. Now, there are many people who say there are crimes in every single war, so what's the point in trying to regulate them? Indeed, some argue that by seeking to regulate war and what conduct is acceptable within it, you actually legitimize war or legitimize armed conflict and make it far too easy for states to resort to. Indeed, there are some who argue that in order to actually prevent conflict, it should be seen as so horrible, so disgusting, that states don't enter into it lightly. Regulating and accepting it makes it far too easy. However, there are 4 reasons, I would say, why war crimes law or law of armed conflict is applicable and is useful, and why it's necessary to preserve this body of law. Now, firstly, they are essentially pragmatic. They work to a reasonably large extent. Now, often they're violated or ignored, but enough of the rules are observed enough of the time so that mankind is better to have this body of law than not to have it. Secondly, they diminish the corrosive effect of mortal combat on participants during an armed conflict. Obviously, during an armed conflict, you are allowed to target and kill your enemy. However, that's not the purpose in and of itself. The purpose is to win the armed conflict. So if you can do that without necessarily killing your enemy, that is to be pursued. And that's obviously where part of the aspect of war crimes law comes from. It's not just to kill your enemy as easily as possible. There are certain rules that are there to reduce suffering and also to reduce casualties, while still achieving the same military advantage that you would seek in an armed conflict. Thirdly, they actually make peace more possible, or in any case less difficult, by preventing the polarization of positions to such an extent. If you have an armed conflict where essentially there are no rules and horrific things have been done from one side to another, that does make peace very, very complicated. If there has been instead at least some minimal level of adherence to certain rules or standards, that may, and I stress the word may, make it easier to actually come to a peace agreement to resolve that conflict. Now, they also provide a bottom line, a minimal standard of what is regarded as acceptable even in conflict.